Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. Today, we are nearing the end of the process of slowly getting to know a poem. We've gone over bean counting, we've gone over listening for sound and sense, we've gone over describing form and figure, and now we're sketching ideas and questions. This phase looks pretty different for almost every poem that I try to get to know. And it looks different because it really depends on the prior notes that I've taken. If I haven't taken any notes, sometimes my ideas and questions about a poem are pretty thin and really come down to simply identifying what we might call a theme. But when I've actually gone through and taken the time to work through these other steps, this fourth step is where I reflect on the notes I've taken, as I've just said, where I consider what I liked the most or loved the most in the poem, where I might assign myself some homework. This is precisely what happened with Donica Kelly's Brood, where I had worked through a lot of the steps and still hadn't noticed the framework of the cicada, and I knew I was missing something, partly because there were words that just wouldn't integrate into my sense of what the poem was doing. So that's when I started digging around a bit and found an interview where Kelly uh, mentioned cicadas, and that's when it clicked that the insect figure on the cover of the book I was reading was also a cicada, and that was what started to kind of pull everything together. So sometimes when I'm in this process, I actually have to go back to previous phases and rethink the notes that I've taken. This is also where I try to think about what else might not line up, what's surprising, what I'm missing, and thus sometimes will then lead me back into revising the notes I've taken. And this is where I'll also isolate and take seriously any questions that the poem itself is posing. And when I do this, I try to remain open to new details that might reframe everything I've already kind of thought about the poem altogether. Now, in the case of Sonnet 9, the the edition that I was reading this poem most recently in, the Art and Shakespeare edition, included a gloss that just sort of struck me. I wouldn't say struck me the wrong way. It's not like I was offended by it, but it did strike me as a somewhat curious comment, where the editor wrote that the weakness of this sonnet in particular lies in its opening proposition: if fear of leaving a widow is not the motive for not marrying. In other words, if the young man or the beloved in the poem is living a single life for reasons other than wanting to sadden a future widow, none of what follows really applies. Now, what sat wrong with me about that is it assumed that the sorts of arguments that a sonnet has to make have to be good faith arguments, or that some or that rhetoric might have ulterior motives than persuading someone of the most direct or literal argument that's being unfolded. And so I started thinking about how this didn't really make sense to me, because it seemed a kind of measuring stick that we don't use when thinking about other works of literature, or if we're considering how irony might factor into how a lyric works, or given my own the homework I had done earlier, especially with respect to how the poem shifts from direct address to general abstraction, there does seem to me some kind of odd triangulation that's happening, suggesting some other motivation. And whether or not that motivation is unconscious, subconscious, whether Shakespeare writes this sonnet um, in order to not just criticize the young man, but also render the speaker themselves somewhat silly or ridiculous, I don't know. These are all possibilities about what the sonnet might be doing. I mean, even something as simple as the framework of being in love with someone being the sort of warrant for ridiculous arguments, I think should be enough to make us question a critic who thinks that a sonnet is weak because its argument's bad or its argument can't literally apply to a situation. This all seems a little misguided. And so for me, the ideas and questions I'm left with are really questions about the role that bad arguments play in a love relationship, how how misdirection works as a kind of tool of provocation or aggravation in love relationships, the role that amplification plays, because it doesn't seem right to me to say that the speaker actually believes that the person is avoiding marriage because they don't want to make someone weep. They don't believe that no more than they actually believe that the whole world is going to become a widow when the beloved dies. This is poetic and lyric amplification and exaggeration and figuration. And so that leaves a lot of homework left to do with respect to these more general questions that I've posed. And it maybe also comes back to the question the poem itself asks: is it for fear to wet a widow's eye that thou consumest thyself in single life? The editor suggests that the answer to this is no, then the rest of the poem is pointless. But what if it's a rhetorical question? What if it's not actually addressed to the beloved? What if it's a thought experiment? Um, or if it is posed to the beloved, what if, again, the speaker just keeps talking and doesn't wait for an answer? Anyway, it does seem to me there's a lot going on here that also would maybe necessitate looking at other poems, other Shakespeare sonnets, and thinking about how the arguments in those sonnets may also lean on things like misdirection, ironic rhetoric, bad arguments, that there might be a sort of an implicit demonstration of the relationship between love and passion and argumentation that is also kind of about the interesting figurative substitutions that happen in comparisons and substitutions that happen in this poem. Anyway, that's as far as I've gotten. I don't plan, of course, to write an article about Shakespeare's sonnets. I'm not trained to do that. But if I were having a conversation with someone or part of a reading group that was working through the sonnets, these might be the kinds of things that I have in the back of my head that go beyond just, say, identifying a theme, like the fear of marriage or single life or love or um, sorrow. What if, though, we turn to Morning Song? Now, I have not worked or at least recorded all my notes about this poem here. I did share my bean counting notes. I went back in and did write in some notes regarding sound and sense. I have not gone in to talk about the forms and figures of the poem, although there are, of course, fantastic ones pertaining to places. So the hospital being kind of comparatively framed as a museum at one point. Um, the idea of a far sea, the framework, the sort of metaphor or anti-metaphor of a cloud, and the child being a kind of mirror. This is the interestingly odd mechanical and material metaphors early on used to describe the baby as both precious but also getting at other less sentimental observations about a new child joining a family. Anyway, the ideas here, the question, there are no questions in this poem, Love Set You Going Like a Fat Gold Watch. These are all statements. So the poem itself does not ask any questions. But I'm left with a question about the relationship between the song and the title, um, the two cries. Um, so that those would be lines 2 and line, let me see, 15, 14, line 13, lines 2 and 13, and then the notes, notes and vowels of lines 17 and 18. So what I'm left with wondering is uh, who sings, who cries, um, what role does responsiveness play in the dynamic of the songs and cries? After all, the poem itself seems to learn from the baby a mode of responding, um, responding to mourning, the beginning of something new, a new life, a new family, new relationship, or a new day. The poem's not just about motherhood, about being a mother or not being a mother. Um, it seems to explore several different ideas about a new relationship, a new relationship, a relationship to an object, to a mystery, to a stranger, a responsibility, um, a song, a beautiful being, a voice. Wait, so as I'm just sort of demonstrating now, these aren't things that I had rehearsed ahead of time. This is me just trying and following through on the verb sketch and at the heading here, sketching ideas and questions. Morning song refers refers to the bald cry, but also the cry in the night and the handful of notes and the poem itself. The poem itself. Now, this doesn't get me very far per se, doesn't get me very far per se, but it starts to provide some ideas for returning to different moments in the poem, especially this third tercet, which I've mentioned more than once in these videos as one of my favorite moments in my experience as a reader of poetry. And I think one thing that stands out about it is that it's surprising. It's surprising three tercets into a short poem that seems to be about new life for a speaker who I think most readers would assume to be the mother from the very beginning, to just kind of so bluntly and boldly say, I'm no more your mother than this other sort of cluster of images and what they express. So it's not necessarily a denial of motherhood outright, but on first blush, it does seem to be a denial of it. Um, and a reframing of the mother position or the parental position that sort of desentimentalizes it, that takes a kind of sobering view of that, uh, the sort of copy logic that we see both in Shakespeare and also saw um, in the Mise en Abîme poem a few days ago. There is something sort of negative here, but also something incredibly beautiful. A worry and an anxiety of time passing, of one being sort of decentered. Hmm. Something to think more about and how to make sense of that within the framework of what I've just been talking about. Because up to now I've been talking about responses, responsiveness, right? The bald cry responding to this new world that sort of opened up, the cry into the night that becomes a song greeting the morning, the poem itself, which is a sort of voiced in response to the fact of this new life, which also, as it turns out, stands at the beginning, as does Donica Kelly's Brood at the beginning of a collection, Ariel. But that's about responsiveness, and here it's about reflection. And so I'm left with some questions then about, let's put that down. How to think about this pattern of responsiveness of the baby, the speaker, the poem, and the reflection in stanza 3. Hmm. Yes. Okay. So that seems pretty good for sketching ideas and questions. Again, I probably will never write a paper about or an article about Sylvia Plath's Morning Song, but it's a poem I thought I knew pretty well, but this is one of the first times I think I'm actually putting into words some of the questions it leaves me with. There are, of course, other things to think about with respect to the responses the poet records in stanza 2, which belong not just to the speaker and not just to the baby, but to an hour and a we. So that's something that also needs to be thought through. What of the echoes? Um, the blank responses of the we in stanza 2. It does seem stanza 4 and on, something does kind of turn, but those previous stanzas don't go away. Um, so, all right. So that's ideas and questions. Next time we'll move on and elaborate ideas I have or approaches I have for establishing or brainstorming contexts. And this is the stage where I run the thought experiment. If I were to write, say, an essay or an article or a paper about this poem, what kind of wider contexts would I start to situate some of these observations in? I start to ask, so what? And direct that question not just to how the parts of the poem work together, but how that working connects to something outside of itself. And there's all kinds of things poems can connect to outside of themselves. Um, so I'll go over how I reckon with and think about that step next. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Hope you read some poems today. And I hope you read some poems with me tomorrow, too.